Hello there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, we are talking about the fifth Roger Moore James Bond adventure, which means we are talking about For Your Eyes Only. For Your Eyes Only was something of a reset for the Roger Moore era. We discussed in my video previously that there really are three eras of Roger Moore. There's kind of the Guy Hamilton, Tom Mankiewicz years of Live and Let Die and The Man with a Golden Gun, with a particular version of the character that forms there. And then there's the Louis Gilbert era with The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, both sharing a lot of DNA. In those films, the Roger Moore Bond persona really kind of crystallizes into its final form, and that version of the character certainly carries over here into the John Glenn era. But there is a shift in the approach of these movies, starting with For Your Eyes Only. It's a very intentional scale back down to earth. There's a lot of through lines that continue with the Roger Moore era here and into Octopussy and A View to a Kill, but there's a different posture with the series. I would say in many ways, For Your Eyes Only is the first Bond film to really feel like just another Bond film, right? It's just another Bond movie. It's not coming at you with a high concept pitch. It's not trying to be the most epic Bond film of them all. It is just another Bond movie. You can depend on it to be there. It'll be there every few years, as it was during the 80s. You can depend on it to show up. You can trust that eventually there's going to be another good Bond movie. It's not going to reinvent the wheel. It's just going to have some new memorable set pieces, some new memorable characters, but it'll be that same formula you love. And I think in some ways that's why Bond fans really gravitate to For Your Eyes Only, or at least I suspect that's why they do, because when it comes to For Your Eyes Only, I feel like an outsider looking in. For Your Eyes Only is a film that has some good merits, and we'll talk about that, but it is a film that I have always ranked as one of the weakest Bond films, and revisiting it in preparation for this video did not sway my opinion of it. I hate to say, mostly bored, which has generally been my reaction when I watch For Your Eyes Only. I find it to be a bit stale, a bit stodgy, pretty unmemorable. And we'll get into why that is, but I think maybe what I find somewhat forgettable about it is what other Bond fans find really enjoyable about it. There's something unassuming, unpretentious about For Your Eyes Only. It is very just kind of a meat and potatoes Bond film, in which, Roger Moore, who is really faultless in all of his Bond movies, he's always very committed to the character, and he's very committed here. He gives a very capable, likable rendition of his Bond in the context of a slightly more grounded take. I mean, there's still plenty of the sort of like Roger Moore humor in this film, though it's less of the exaggerated variety. Certainly you're not getting any of the, Lawrence of Arabia song quotes or the slide whistle for the car flip. There's not that sort of like strong camp that actually comes back in the next movie, Octopussy. But there are still nods in the direction of that silliness, like the closer with Margaret Thatcher, and the kind of the relationship with Bibi and Bond's relationship there is again, it's not unrealistic, but it's kind of like it has that sort of humor. Roger Moore is able to really lean into that. Like, oh yeah, like the car chase too in particular is such a Roger Moore version of an action sequence. But again, this is a movie that leaves me kind of uninspired, and we'll kind of walk through this movie piece by piece here, as I often do. But first off, I want to say thematically, one thing that this movie does highlight about Roger Moore's version of the character that has been true over the previous movies a little bit, but is really crystallized here, is that Roger Moore is really the sportsman of Bonds. He is, he is a skier. He's kind of like, there's kind of like a very sort of like all-arounder sportsman vibe to Roger Moore. I mean, he's able to do the hunting rifle thing in Moonraker. He's a very adept skier, and that's something that carries through right up to the end, where he's doing his sort of like Beach Boys snow surfing, snowboarding moment in A View to a Kill, which we'll talk about in that movie. Like, there's a sense in which Roger Moore is always, surprisingly, given that he doesn't have a reputation for being the most physical Bond, is like the most athletic Bond. And you really get that in this movie, because the one thing you can say for Your Eyes Only is it's very, very robust in its approach to set pieces. The story is relatively grounded and subdued, too much so, in my opinion. I don't think there's enough color in it, mainly because the characters that are prominent in the story are a bit too dialed back in a lot of ways. But the sense here that the set pieces are very athletic, right? You have, obviously, the big snow action sequences that are very full of very memorable stunt work, but there's also that very sort of like Iger sanctioned style climbing sequence. And that kind of stuff is really, is a really compelling element of Bond, and it's interesting that Roger Moore's Bond, of all of them, is the one that really leans into that the most, because he doesn't have the reputation for being that sort of most, like, dynamic Bond, but he's the one that skydives. He's the one that climbs cliffs. He's the one that is doing incredible skiing stunt work. Like, when we get to Pierce Brosnan doing his version of a snow set piece, he's not, doing the wild backflips and things that we've seen with Moore's Bond in The Spy Who Loved Me. It is the sense that Roger Moore's Bond is part of his capability and skill set is very much just being this sort of like dynamic playboy sportsman. And I think that's an interesting element that For Your Eyes Only really crystallizes, because we've seen his character mostly fully formed by the time you hit Moonraker. I mean, that is the Roger Moore Bond through and through. Spy Who Loved Me, he's still transitioning off of the kind of like rougher edges of the Guy Hamilton run. But by the time you've gotten to Moonraker, he is, this veteran 007 with like a strong command of his craft, so to speak. And here, For Your Eyes Only really does treat him as an older agent. There is it's seen back to back with Moonraker. It's almost a jarring transition how much For Your Eyes Only is suddenly like, okay, accentuating Moore's age, and not in ways that I think are entirely successful. So, but it's there right from the get-go. So we are introduced at the start of this movie to a kind of a follow-up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. In my opinion, a very unsatisfying follow-up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But this was pointed out by one of the commenters in my video for The Spy Who Loved Me, that Spy Who Loved Me was the first movie after On Her Majesty's Secret Service to really reference Tracy in some way. And this movie goes all in on that idea in terms of this Bond is definitively the one with the history we know about, bringing Tracy and this sort of like legacy of past trauma into the character's backstory once again. And with that comes a sort of slight melancholy as we open with Bond visiting Tracy's grave. It then shifts, obviously, into an attempt where Blofeld, who is not explicitly named, but is very clearly Blofeld, is going to attempt to get his revenge on Bond one last time, many decades after the fact. I suppose we're meant to believe that Blofeld has just been kind of hanging out for a decade or so since we last saw him. The sequence is kind of strange. The stunt work is fun. I generally enjoy the helicopter work. In general, as always in the prior Moore movies, there's a lot of really fun stunt work if you're just willing to accept the fact that, like, some of the stunt work is done by very transparent stunt guys. But and then when you see Roger Moore, there's going to be some sort of, like, obvious green screen. I have never had a problem with that sort of transition. Like, the Spy Who Loved Me stuff where, you know, you're seeing real ski work and then you're just seeing Roger Moore, you know, in front of the screen, just kind of like bounding around. Like, I'm very accepting of those sorts of transitions because the stunt work in these movies feels so tactile and authentic and real. And there's a lot of really, really great stunt work in For Your Eyes Only throughout the entirety of the movie. I mean, that's one of the real strengths of this movie, is that, like, there are a lot of really great practical set pieces. You know, we get the helicopter sequence, we're getting underwater sequences, we're getting ski sequences, we're getting cliff climbing sequences. There is a lot to appreciate on that scale. But this sequence is really, honestly, one of the weakest pre-title sequences in the series. Not because of the stunt work. The stunt work is perfectly fine, but just because of the baggage this scene has. It treats Blofeld as a throwaway joke, which would be fine if it hadn't anchored it into, you know, the Tracy moment. In many ways, if Diamonds Are Forever was an unsatisfying pivot after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, this is also a very unsatisfying follow-up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Blofeld is kind of treated as a throwaway joke here. And the comedy here with, like, you know, the delicatessen and stainless steel line and Bond dropping Blofeld into a chimney being the transition into the title sequence, it just feels kind of off. At its worst, For Your Eyes Only has these moments where, like, the comedy and tone doesn't feel quite right, and that's definitely the case with this sequence. If it had just been a sequence about Bond being attacked in a helicopter and having to fight for his life, it's actually a pretty exciting, fun sequence. And it's one of the places in the score where I really dig the kind of Bill Conti approach to action sequences. His score is kind of a love-hate thing for me. I find the disco-ness of it is so pronounced that it sometimes loses what I think is really important in Bond music. I've done a video on the Bond sound, that Bond music at its best, as it's laid out in the John Barry template, is about finding the extra, you know, poetic dimension in Bond. Even when Bond is being kind of like trivial and goofy, it should be expanding the scope, making it feel more epic and rich. There's a sense in which Bill Conti's score sometimes trivializes what it's depicting. It's a little too jaunty, but I really like it during the pre-title sequence. And what is interesting about the way that the title sequence closes with Blofeld being dropped down a chimney is it just continues this trend that we've seen in the past few movies of this motif of, like, dropping down into the title sequence. You know, Bond parachutes down into the Spy Who Loved Me's title sequence. Jaws tumbles on down into a circus tent into Moonraker's title sequence, and here Blofeld drops down a chimney, and then we are in the For Your Eyes Only title sequence. This notably is the only title sequence to have the singer performing for us, so it has an even more, like, music video feel than usual, but it kind of works in this instance. something happens around The Spy Who Loved Me with the song Nobody Does It Better, and followed up to some extent with the ballad Moonraker, is that this really is the run, at least up until the shift with A View to a Kill, of the love ballad Bond song. And it emphasizes this sense that really comes out again around The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, that Roger Moore's Bond has a sort of sentimental, tender side. We didn't see that in his first two movies, but we see that now, that the sense that he is a little bit softer, and his songs, are really in this sort of romantic, soft state, this sort of gentle, tender feeling. And it's easy to have nostalgia for it. I think Bond fans have become very accustomed to these songs being part of the canon so often now, but it's interesting that I think were the series to do a song like this today with its contemporary equivalent, they would really struggle with it. Because the songs that we're hearing here during this era, All Time High, For Your Eyes Only, even Nobody Does It Better, there's nothing especially what we would call like Bondian about them, in the way that you hear a song like Skyfall today by Adele and instantly recognize it as a Bond song with this sort of immediate Bond sound. These are love ballads of the era. For Your Eyes Only is very much a pop song of its time. And it would be kind of interesting to see Bond movies do that again. Really just, not put aside the attempts at pastiche, stop trying to just create another Goldfinger or Diamonds Are Forever, and once again return to a very contemporary approach. They haven't done that in a while, and I think it would be great to have just like a really good modern love song in a Bond movie. But my broader thematic point there is that that's really emphasizing the romantic side of Roger Moore's Bond. But I think that angle, as explored in the song, is better executed in the song than it is in the movie. I actually like Bond's relationship with Melina on paper. But Melina Havelock, who is the primary female lead of For Your Eyes Only, has, as cast, a very awkward connection with Roger Moore's Bond. Roger Moore's Bond feels very senior here, so to speak. He is dressed more, conservatively, and sort of, there's to be unkind, kind of stodgy look about him in this movie. It's very classic, but there's like the cool swagger of Roger Moore's wardrobe in the first four movies is kind of completely lost. In general, this movie has a slightly subdued, drab look, and his wardrobe is in more drab colors. It's a little less, snazzy, and so he feels his age, and she's just so young. It feels a lot like Bond, kind of like an older Bond, pursuing his colleague's young daughter. She just seems so young in comparison to Moore's Bond that it really feels like that should be more of like a mentorship relationship than a romantic one. And the movie really tries to lean into making it a romantic one, and it just doesn't work for me. Whereas I think the scenes where they're in a kind of like more, family friend, like father-daughter dynamic, I think that actually feels a lot more natural in this movie, and I kind of wish they'd gone in that direction. And it also doesn't help that the movie then introduces the secondary Bond girl in Bibi that is really all about how Bond is an old guy now. It's like, oh yeah, Bond won't touch this young girl, but he's still fine to go after this very young gal over here. And it just, I don't know. That's a part of my disconnection with this movie, because I think that thrust of the story between the two of them. Bond trying to mentor this person who is going to pursue revenge and potentially be forever damaged by it. This grieving person is compelling enough territory, and indeed, you know, it's territory that the series revisits again in the Craig era with Quantum of Solace, and I think that's one of the more successful elements in that movie is the Cameo relationship. And I think this movie, it's fine on paper, but the casting, just the age difference just doesn't work for me as a romance. I actually kind of find it a little uncomfortable. And you know, yeah, the other aspect that I don't particularly love about that story is that it doesn't find a good way of like weaving Melina's character arc into the first section of the movie. She just kind of like arbitrarily shows up as Bond's investigating with this idea that she had been lured there, and then Bond sends her away and meets up with her later. It's just kind of like this weird, oh yeah, don't forget about her, she's part of this story, kind of like hook. She has a nice, strong introduction when she and Bond meet in Spain, in terms of, like, you know, the actual lift from the Fleming short story where she's there to assassinate the guy and Bond wasn't anticipating her being there. But the movie doesn't kind of build on that momentum right away. It shifts over into Bond investigating Locke and kind of going down his other rabbit trail. So this movie narratively is a collision of a few different Fleming short stories, and you kind of feel that they don't really all quite fit together. There's a sense in which these character dynamics kind of keep bouncing off of each other, and they've built this idea that it's going to be like a For Your Eyes Only, a From Russia with Love style story with, like, in that you have the Lecter decoder, here you have the ATAC, so everybody has to get the ATAC, and it's kind of like a hunt to get the ATAC and find out where it is, and they're hunting for that, but really there's these dueling smugglers, and then there's this whole other scheme about, like, you know, assassinating Melina's father, and then in this she's seeking revenge. Topol's character is also seeking revenge. It doesn't all fit very nicely, and in fact a lot of the investigation piece in the first half of the movie is pretty rote. I do like the sort of like Bond pursuing Locke kind of thing. It's very like of its time, but like the Identigraph is kind of a fun bit with like Bond targeting the guy based on his appearance and Bond trying to chase down Locke. In fact, when Bond finally does chase down Locke and kicks him off a cliff, which was an element of brutality that Roger Moore actually had great reservations with. He didn't really like Bond kicking the car off the cliff, famously. It's that kind of arc works a lot better than his pursuit of the main villain. I think Kristatos and Krieger are perhaps like the most forgettable villain and henchman pairing in this entire series, and it's a big reason that the story doesn't work for me in a lot of ways, because Bond is just like following Kristatos around for such a big portion of this movie, and Kristatos has no real menace, he has no real distinguishing characteristics, he's just kind of like a guy who's there. There's just a lot of talky scenes with him and Bond that don't have a lot of even a lot of clever wordplay, which is so disappointing coming after Moonraker, where you have such fun byplay between Drax and Bond. In this, it feels like they're trying to go for like that sort of more From Russia with Love, like subdued Bond investigates kind of feeling, but it doesn't have the same rich character, at least not until Topol shows up. And Topol is wonderful. But Topol can't help but be charming. He's just like such a warm, wonderful film presence. So bringing him into your movie is almost like a trump card in that regard. He's so delightful to watch, and he's the one exception that I have in this movie about like there's Bond and a bunch of characters I don't really like enjoy that much. Topol is excellent. He is the true successor to the Kerim Bey figure in this series. It is really wonderful to watch. But I don't really ever get invested in this, like, who is the Dove mystery they're setting up. There's like this side character of Ferrara who gets killed, and while Bond is having his getting bounced around in an ice rink, which is the one exception I have to my conviction that this movie has really good set pieces. I think the hockey bit is just like a bit of extraneous nonsense that the movie didn't really need. You know, like, he's just such a, like, sort of like nothing little side ally character. BB isn't adding up to much beyond just being like a sort of like whining figure. Like, she doesn't even help Bond in his investigation very much. She's just kind of like thrown in there to give a little bit extra color, I guess, to Kristatos as a villain. It's just, I don't know. I know nothing about that works for me at all. And I think that's a big reason I just kind of like check out from the movie, because if you're going to do a spy focused narrative, you really have to kind of make sure those dynamics are really interesting on a scene by scene basis. And it just feels like really the movie is about getting to the next set piece. And I wish the movie was more of that. Like, I wish the movie cut back on some of the intrigue, and it was just kind of like, okay, and now this, and now this, and now this, in the kind of way that it was like a more of a roller coaster ride than trying to be a spy thriller. Because I don't think the spy thriller pieces of this hold a lot of weight. They're not dealing with interesting threats. It's just sort of like standard smuggling stuff. It does pick up a bit once the ATAC comes back into the picture. The underwater stuff with Bond getting the ATAC from the sunken wreck, and then being dragged behind Kristatos' boat for the sharks, and then the final assault on the monastery. I think that's all like a potentially really great climax. I just don't think it's built up the character dynamics in a way that's satisfying. In fact, you have dueling revenge stories, so really that climax should really hit. But by the time you get to Kristatos' demise, there's not really like that big satisfying payoff that you would hope for, or at least I would hope for. I will say one thing that's interesting about the way this film concludes is it continues this thread that we have seen over the Roger Moore era of this sort of tension with the Soviet Union, but not quite full-on animosity. This sort of live and let live aspect to their relationship, and that's a détente, comrade, is one of the greatest lines Bond has had in the series to date. I mean, it's such a good punchline for that final scene, and obviously destroying the ATAC, I don't have it, you don't have it, is just, it's that, to me, is a great closer to what I wish was more of a satisfying build-up. But some other notes here, I think in many ways that there is a bit of enjoyment to be had in the fact that this movie is the first one in the Roger Moore run to really give Roger Moore his big casino scenes. I think Octopussy will take that and do it better. I mean, Octopussy's backgammon stuff is just some of the best Roger Moore material ever, and I really love Octopussy. Can't wait to talk about it. But it is nice to see Roger Moore back in, like, Bond in a casino again. I think that stuff is very fun. You kind of get this flavor that you had with The Saint of, like, Roger Moore kind of, like, being this sort of playboy foil. I like him, and I like the brief interactions with the Countess. She is, like, the more mature woman of this movie and feels like a more natural pairing for Roger Moore's Bond. I think that sort of dynamic feels a little bit more natural. Though, again, that whole section has a sort of, like, been there, done that attitude towards it. There's a way, and I mean this not, this is going to sound like a backhanded remark towards this movie, but it's not. this movie really feels like the Columbo episode of Bond movies. There's something very like a little bit small scale, a little bit like ho hum about it. Like the pacing is a little lax. It just feels like kind of like a TV episode that you would kind of check in with. And that may be doing a disservice. I love Columbo. And some of the Columbo episodes are really great, like the one famously directed by Steven Spielberg. But a lot of it was just kind of like familiar TV entertainment. And I feel like For Your Eyes Only is the familiar TV entertainment of Bond films. And for me, it just doesn't quite click. I find something like Moonraker or even The Man with the Golden Gun considerably a little bit more electric in terms of what it's doing. There's just a little bit more color. There's a little bit more of that Fleming flair for surrealism and the bizarre in it. And I kind of think For Your Eyes Only has a lot of the right pieces. It just doesn't go for the sort of weird, sensationalized aspect on top of them that might have kicked it up a notch in my book. But feel free to sound off in the comments. Let me know how much you disagree with me. I've been kind of stalling and dreading making this video because I don't really particularly enjoy making videos where all I'm doing is complaining about a movie. I really like to explore what works about a movie, and I wish I had more positive things to say about For Your Eyes Only, because I also mean I have more interesting things to say about For Your Eyes Only. But rest assured, I will have plenty to say about Octopussy, which will be the next film we cover, because I think Octopussy is a fantastic Bond movie. So I look forward to catching you in that discussion, and I hope you'll be there for it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.